Our speaker this evening is Pastor Joe Green. He is head pastor at St. Paul's Missionary Church in Harrisburg. He is married. His wife's name is Gwendolyn, and they have 4 children. We first heard of him as he was recommended to us by Pennsylvania Family Institute. And I sat right across the table from from Michael Greer, and we talked about this person, and we got a chance to actually run into each other at the Pennsylvania Family Institute banquet, had some conversation with him over the past month or so. Come to really appreciate him. Some of his bio is in your program, so I'll let you read through that. Just let me say, I know he has a very biblical view on racial and social issues, and he has been involved personally on that level on a practical basis over a number of years. So he has a lot of experience to go with that. So with that, would you welcome Pastor Joe Green?
There it goes. Good evening, good evening. How's everyone doing? Oh, that was kind of weak. You guys could do better than that. How's everybody doing this evening? So good to be with you guys, and it's an honor to be here and to talk about this. One of the things that I would say, and you'll hear me throughout this weekend, I'm just appreciative that people come out to hear me speak, and hopefully I'll say something to you that is beneficial to you, edifying to you, but more importantly, edifying to the body of Christ and gives glory to the Lord, amen? Because that's what really ultimately all this stuff is about. I think that these topics are so important, and hopefully you'll see over the course of the next couple of days, and I'll say it and probably reiterate it, that in order for us as the church, the body of Christ, to fully manifest the preaching and the spreading of the gospel, conversations like this are vitally important, and you'll see why. Just for the record, get a couple things cleared up as we go forward. Just want everybody to realize that I'm black. Been black my whole life. Some of my closest family members are black, and so, but I love everybody, right? Every tribe and every tongue. And it's so important for us to talk about things in order for us to come together and grow together in Christ. Tonight's talk, I'm going to try to go about an hour, maybe a little bit over an hour in my talk. We're going to cover a lot of information, but a lot of the information will be kind of covered also in the other sessions that we do. And then I would like to, if at all possible, open up the floor for a couple of questions if anyone has any questions or want clarity, because I think that this is so important what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about CRT, we're going to talk about race, and hopefully we can come to some type of understanding that will equip us to have conversations. One of the things that has happened in America and throughout is that there has, over the last few years especially, been a pronounced spirit of division in the nation along what we call race. And I've been probably about 10 or 15 years having similar conversations, maybe not specifically about CRT, but about race relationships and reconciliation and all those type of things. And I believe that it's because the body of Christ hadn't done a really good job at having these conversations proactively that it allows the enemy to come in and shape the conversation, and when the enemy shapes the conversation, it just brings more animosity and division. There are real issues that people are facing on every angle, and because a lot of times we haven't had those conversations or really listened to people, it causes more animosity. Let me give you an example. In the Bible, when Jesus gives the Great Commission and he says, preach the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to do all the things that I've commanded you, most of us have said nations as in countries, right? So we have, how many of you have done missionary work? Going to other countries, and so that's kind of how we got to get some more missionaries around here. But anyway, that's normally how we feel. We feel like preaching the gospel to all nations, so I might have to go to South America, Africa, Europe, or Asia in order to preach the gospel. But the word in the Bible for nations is actually the word ethnos, and it means ethnicity. And so the core of Jesus' Great Commission is that we are to go out and to spread the gospel to other ethnicities and cultures. And how many of you know that I don't have to go all the way to South America or Africa or Europe to encounter other ethnicities, right? But we haven't been proactive in that, and we kind of stay in our own comfort zone and around people that look and act like us, or we're comfortable. And I would submit to you that that means that we are not fully manifesting the commission, the commandment that Jesus gave us in spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it has to matter to us. Amen. It has to matter to us, because if we truly are living for Christ and we're the body of Christ and we're supposed to be doing what Christ has commanded us, then we need to do that part of it too. Amen. Amen. I'm from a Baptist church, so it's okay for you guys to give me a little bit back. Amen. There you go. I like that. So, of course, I've already been introduced. And you'll find out more about me, hopefully. Hopefully you guys will stick around and come to more of the sessions and get to know me and get to know my heart. And hopefully I'll be able to give you guys some things to equip you to really be what God's called us to be. Amen. Amen. There you go. I like that. So the first thing, I want to establish some boundaries, and hopefully this talk, or not boundaries, but foundational concepts. Hopefully this talk will lay the foundation so that all the talks after this will kind of fit together. So race is a social construct. There is actually no such thing as race. Race was created, and I'm going to talk about why they created the concept of race. The Bible doesn't talk about race. The Bible talks about nations. It had nothing to do with skin color. It had nothing to do with any of those type of things. When God talks about nations, he says that there's good nations and bad nations, sheep nations and goat nations, and it was based on either following his commandments or not. It wasn't based on skin color. And primarily from a scientific standpoint, the concept of race is only a couple of 100 years old, because before that, science believed, which rightfully so, that the different features of what we call race, and you'll hear me say what we call race, or the social construct of race, comes from geography. And so naturally, people that live in sub-Saharan regions like sub-Saharan Africa, they have more melanin in their skin because the sun, and melanin protects you from the sun. The people that live in the northern regions have less melanin because there's less sun, and they don't have to be protected from the sun. That's why someone who has more melanin in their skin, like me, it takes longer for me to get sunburned than persons that have less melanin. So if we start to understand how God looks at things and how he created things, first of all, this whole concept of race was a social construct, and it was meant to not only divide us, but it was meant to be able to victimize a certain group of people. And let me tell you something about a social construct. When someone creates a social construct, the people that create the social construct, if you choose to abide by that social construct, that person now has power over you. What do I mean by that? If I told you guys that there's an invisible brick wall down the middle of this aisle right here, if you guys abide by that construct, I should say, not social, but construct, and instead of just walking across the aisle, you go out and go all the way around, then you have empowered me over you. Are you guys with me? And so if we buy into this concept of race as the world tries to teach us, then the ones who are developing this social construct actually has power over your minds, and it limits us. Can you imagine how, do you guys realize that every human being is like 99.996% the same? Whether you're considered white or black or Asian or whatever, we're all the same. And a race doesn't exist, so anthropologists can't look at your DNA and tell a race. If you ever do a DNA background thing like the 23andMe or whatever, it won't say what race or ethnicity you're from. It'll say that your DNA closely is associated with people that originate from this region, because they can't tell race. That's how you can get a organ transplant or a blood transfusion from somebody who is from a different race. So as human beings, we're all the same. What does the Bible say? From one blood, God created all men to dwell on the face of the earth. So guess what? And I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but all you guys here are my cousins. Some of you are farther down the line than others, but we're all the same, right? That's how God created us. So isn't it ridiculous how the enemy has been empowered so much that we start looking at each other by what they call race, and we start to make judgments we like or dislike, or we are prejudiced against each other, or biased against each other by this social construct that really doesn't exist. And I call it a skin suit. Underneath this epidermis, this layer of skin I have, if we all peeled our skin back, we would all be exactly the same. But there's just different features. So I talked about melanin in the skin. I talked about like nostrils of people from the sub-Saharan. They have wider nostrils because the air is thinner, and so it takes more air to breathe in to get more oxygen, whereas people from the northern regions have thinner nostrils because the air is thicker. And so all these features are based on geography, but what they did was they began this concept of race, and they start to attribute characteristics to these different physical features. A lot of times it's not even really how we disagree with each other. It's not really race, but it's cultural differences. Because a lot of people gravitate towards people that look like them, and so they have a certain culture, and people outside of the culture have a different culture. And a lot of times, because we haven't spent enough time understanding culture versus race, we attribute, like for instance, there's times as a black person that people will listen to me on the phone and say, well, you don't sound black. And I'll say, well, what does a black person sound like? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to announce that when I answer the phone? Hello, this is Joe Green. I'm black. How can I help you? Right? But what they're doing is they're attributing some of the slang that black people may use from their culture. Right? But if you went to some, and I won't have time to get into it right now, but it mainly comes from culture and not from race. Really quick story. I was in India years ago doing missionary work. And I went to a Hindu village, and this Hindu village was very hostile towards the gospel before we got there. So I know all this. I go in there, I'm doing this meeting. At the end of the meeting, it was a whole field of people in there, and 18 people gave their life to the Lord, and I'm on cloud 9, right? The Spirit of the Lord moved, and people gave their life to Jesus. And so I'm standing on stage, and my host and everybody's on that side of the stage. This Hindu guy walks up to me, and he's a little bit shorter than I am. He has the dot, which is a Hindu symbol. They put the red dot on their forehead, and how he was dressed. And he speaks in a language that I don't understand because I didn't understand his language, which is why I had to have an interpreter. So now, when I'm talking to you right now, if I'm positively affirming what you're saying, I go like this. But some places in India, they don't do that. They do like this. So just to let you know, I grew up in the inner city. They call it the hood. This gentleman, who I don't understand his language, walks up to me. He's in my personal space. He's talking real fast, and he's doing his head like this to me. So I said, Bishop, come here, hurry up. And he came over to me. I said, please translate what he's saying. He said he would like for you to pray for him and his family. I said, oh, that's amazing. Tell him, bless him. I'd love to pray for him. I said, but just let him know where I come from. If somebody gets in your face and they're doing like this, it's usually a problem. And I could have caused an international incident by, I went up to this preacher and I asked him to pray for me, and he grabbed me because I misinterpreted culturally what was happening. And how many times did it happen in America? A lot of times that happens because we are misinterpreting culture and we have attributed to race. It kind of widens the gap. Are you guys with me? So understand, a lot of stuff is culture or ethnicity, not race, but we have made it race. Now let me tell you how ingrained, because we have to have open and honest conversations in order for us to move forward. And I want to equip you guys that if you really honestly and truly want to have these conversations in a productive way to help get cut through all the confusion and all the division, then let me tell you some honest facts. So there's a thing called white supremacy, and we'll talk about that a lot of the founding fathers came from certain regions. But when they started to promote the ideal of race, this gentleman was one of the main people that promoted that, Charles Darwin. You guys have heard of Charles Darwin, right? The origin of the species is when they teach the theory of evolution and all that other stuff. And that's actually based on race, and I'll show you proof of that. But you had Charles Darwin, you had a gentleman by the name of Malthus, and you also had another gentleman by the name of Dalton. So they promoted not only the ideal of race, But because they also actually promoted race and evolution, the idea was as they separated people in races, and there's three primary races, as we say, that social construct of race. You have Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, right? So they said that they promoted the idea that the Caucasoid race was more evolved than the other races. And that's where you get colonialization and all that idea, manifest destiny and all that other stuff. But anyway, Charles Darwin promoted the idea of race as a way to promote the idea that certain races were less evolved, which helped to justify the enslavement of people. So you have what's known as white supremacy. It's the belief that the white race or the Caucasoid race was more evolved and more advanced than the others. And so CRT proponents, or those who promote CRT, base the need for CRT that the United States is based on white supremacy, which is an obstacle for non-blacks to succeed in the U.S. There's also a thing called white privilege that they adhere to, or that they promote, that idea that inherent advantages possessed by white people on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. So those are two things that CRT is based on. They hang their hat on. And so you need to understand those concepts, but you also have to understand that there is a real ideology that they are addressing, but that ideology I would submit to you, and before the end of my talk, I hope that you would see that ideology doesn't have the same impact now that it once had. So this is the first page, and I usually carry my book of Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species. This is the inside cover, and the subtitle, it's called The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, which is where they get the idea of evolution from. How many of you know that that's what they've been teaching our children in school for a long time as science, which is an antichrist, and I won't get into that right now, but maybe later. The subtitle is The Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The preservation of the favored races. And so the whole idea that one race was more evolved than others gave them the justification to enslave people from Africa. Now think about this. If you can promote the idea that one race is more evolved and more human than others, then that would give a justification that maybe the people that weren't involved in slavery, but they didn't object to it because they felt like black people were less human. It's like your dog. You see somebody walking the dog down the street, most of us don't get offended and say, that's a shame that you would put that dog on a leash and treat him like that, because we understand that dogs are, and I hope I don't offend any dog lovers, because I know some people don't believe this, but dogs are lower on the food chain than human beings. I have some people that will get upset if you said that, and so that's why we don't get upset, because we recognize that they're less than human. And so is the same idea, because they promoted the idea of race, that certain races of people were less human than others. Now, as I go forward, some of these conversations may be a little bit uncomfortable, but I want you to understand that in order for us to really grow and develop and fulfill what we call to do, we have to have these conversations. Because if we don't have them on the front end, that's when you get Ferguson. That's when you get riots. That's when you get all these kind of things, because these issues left undiscussed. And then, of course, you have the people that don't want us to grow and have unity and reconciliation. They'll come in and give you a conversation that's going to cause more and more division. I won't go in too much, but this is a critical race timeline. I'll make sure Nate, he has this PowerPoint, and if anybody wants it and they see him, he could probably get it to them. It just talks about the critical race theory timeline and how it was developed. So the philosophy that led to that was a philosophy that was around for a while. It's not a new philosophy, but the manifestation of it through this. Now let's talk a little bit about slavery, because like I said, we have to have open and honest conversations. Some people that are proponents of CRT, when we object to CRT, one of the first objections they say is, oh, you don't want CRT taught because we want to ignore the fact that there was slavery in America. But that's not necessarily true, because CRT isn't a historical, it's not just looking at history, because if you actually report history, you don't have to editorialize history, you just give the facts, right? That's what history is all about. And so there are facts that we have to discuss that are real facts. We can't ignore them, it did happen, but we have to do it in a way that, from a scholarly way, and to me, when we talk about the past and look at where we're at in America, it actually gives credit to America, right? Because America, for some of you who don't know, was one of the first parts of civilization that made a conscious and legal determination that it was wrong to enslave other people. Slavery is one of the oldest institutions in human history, and slavery still exists around the world in other places, even in Africa, right? Right now, there's 20 million slaves in the world. Still. Now, you had William Wilberforce in Great Britain, and after that, the abolitionists in America that made a conscious stand to say that slavery was wrong. But before that, slavery was not considered a moral injustice until that point. So when people try to talk about slavery, because America didn't invent slavery, they inherited slavery. And so because they inherited slavery, and they, less than 100 years after the actual formation of this nation, made it illegal for slavery to occur, shouldn't be something that says what a terrible country it is, but say that the principles that our founding fathers created this country under were ones that allowed them to come to the conclusion that slavery was wrong. And it was those who were proponents of the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ that took the forefront, whether it was the Methodists or the Quakers or those type of people. They took the forefront in not only fighting against slavery and making this moral stand that it was wrong, but many of them participated in the Underground Railroad and risked their lives and their livelihood and their household and their families in order to fight against the scourge of slavery. So slavery dates back to, as we know, the transatlantic slave trade back to the 1400s. It originated in Europe. The actual word slave comes from the word Slavic, and so the first slaves were actually Europeans. And the other part of that is when the Europeans got to Africa, they didn't go snatch people off the streets. They actually went there and they traded for people that were already enslaved, because it was certain tribes that enslaved other tribes. And so they went and traded for weapons and guns for those that were already enslaved. And again, it wasn't a black and white thing originally. It was all about economics. So those who participated in slavery was about economics. Originally, they introduced the idea of race to perpetuate it and to keep many people in the public from speaking out against it. Here's an interesting fact most people don't know. So slavery at first was indentured servitude. So you came over here and you were indentured servant for 5 to 7 years, and then you could earn your freedom. And many people used that to get passage into the New World. When they first came over here, they were actually looking for a trade route to get to Asia, and they discovered this. Well, let me say this. I always laugh at that word, discovered something. Like, the continent was here and there were people here already, right? So, you know, like what's your address, Nate? How would it look like me showing up at your house, say, look, I discovered a house here, right? So this idea that they discovered America is kind of funny because there were actually people here, and you know. But anyway, that's a whole nother talk. Originally, it was indentured servitude, and after indentured servitude, they could earn their freedom. But there was this gentleman by the name of Anthony Johnson, because not all black people were slaves. There were actually black slave owners as well. Anthony Johnson was a slave owner, and when slavery transitioned from indentured servitude to what is known as chattel slavery means that the slave became your property, and not only was your property, but any child born to a slave woman was actually owned by the owner. It transitioned. There was a gentleman by the name of Anthony Johnson whose slave escaped because his time had been up. He went back and took him to court, and the courts awarded the fact that he could be a permanent slave or chattel or property. And it was a black person that was the first owner, which had to be a horrible human being, Anthony Johnson. But anyway, so there's some other facts about slavery. We won't go into too many details. But anyway, slavery was real. And like I said, I have this part of the conversation because in order for us to really combat the Marxist socialist ideology behind CRT, we actually have to talk about what really did happen in the past. And here's what I would say to you guys. Sometimes we have these conversations with black Americans, and you know, and they may bring up slavery, and they say residue, which is what CRT talks about, the long-term residue or effects of slavery. And what do a lot of people say? Well, that was a long time ago. That's the wrong answer if you really want to have a productive conversation. That would be like talking to a woman who was raped and she keeps saying, I'm traumatized because I was raped, and that was 30 years ago, get over it. You wouldn't say that, right? Because the trauma is still there, and in order to have a healthy conversation, we have to at least acknowledge that something had happened. Are you guys with me? And so if we sincerely want to have the conversation, we have to do it differently and stop saying that was a long time ago, because there actually was some certain things that occurred that was somewhat of a residual thing because of some of the things of the past. So again, we want to have open and honest dialogue in order for us to move forward in a productive way that helps to build unity and reconciliation and all those things that the Bible talks about. So then in America, we had, of course, you had the Emancipation Proclamation. Then you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which ended slavery, made all people born in America equal citizens. It gave African Americans the right to vote, which they were deprived of in those situations. Some key points of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It extended citizenship to anyone born in the United States, gave African Americans full equality, authorized the president to enforce the act through use of force, and the Enforcement Act of 1870 set out specific penalties for interfering with the right to vote. Then you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which declared that no segregation in public places, no discrimination in employment based on race, gender, or national origin. Now, here's the thing that we have to know as well. When we talk about systemic racism, they'll say America is systemically racist. That's not a true statement. In order for something to be systemically racist, it has to be codified in law or expressed in policy. I'm going to say that again. It has to be codified in law or expressed in policy. So during the time of slavery, you could enslave a person of African descent. That was the law. After that, you had Jim Crow, which meant they could put a sign on the door that said no blacks allowed, and if a black person walked into the store, they could call the cops and that black person would be arrested. That's called systemic racism. But when you had these acts that abolished slavery, and also the Civil Rights Act that didn't allow for segregation in public places, let me tell you how you combat systemic racism. You do it through laws, right? You have bias, prejudice, and those type of things. Those are internal. Those are heart issues. Systemic racism is codified in law. It means that the law says that you could do this and discriminate, right? So here's how you combat it. Before the act of 1964, if a owner put up no blacks allowed, if I walked into the store owner can call the cops and I would be arrested. After the law was passed, I walk into that same store, the store owner calls the cops, the police shows up, he's in trouble because now the law is in my favor. That's how you combat it. And the reason it's so important to define those things is because if you can't properly define the problem, you can never offer a solution. So you can't try to solve racism if it's not racism. Right? If a person is biased or prejudiced, you can't pass a law to change anybody's heart. That takes education and exposure. But if it really is systemic racism, then you can combat that through law. And a lot of times we call things racism that's not racism, is bigotry or bias. Are you guys with me? So it's important to define that. Like the court system found that historically, a lot of times that the courts have been unjust towards people of color. For the same crime, they got more time. So that's not systemic racism. It's a judge who is biased or prejudiced. So you deal with that judge because the laws are already in effect. So I hope that helps somebody, because when you call everything systemically racist and it's not, you can argue all day, but you can never solve that problem. I can't stop anybody from being prejudiced or biased against me by passing a law, right? That doesn't work. Okay, now let's get to the core of what we need to talk now. I wanted to lay that foundation, hopefully provide some understanding. I know I'm moving through these things fast, and you guys have probably heard a lot of this, so that's why I'm moving through it a little bit fast. Of course, we're going to have time over this weekend to answer any questions or anything you want. The PowerPoint will be offered as well. But so in Europe, you had this time of the Enlightenment. And you had these people that considered themselves to be upper class. Some of these philosophers, and most of these philosophers and philosophies was based on Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and all these other things. But something came out called German idealism. Immanuel Kant was one of the main things, and this other gentleman is George Wilhelm Hegel. And so German idealism is one of the things that is being used now, because with German idealism, they came up with this concept that words only have meaning to the person using the words. Words only have meaning to the people using the words. Now, if we buy into the concept of German idealism, the person who is setting the tone will always win the argument. And that's part of what happens with CRT. Because they are the ones that's setting the tone, and they say the words only have meaning to the one who's using the meanings, I can constantly move the goalpost. So here's one of the things that they talk about when they talk about racism, right, and white supremacy and white privilege. So if I'm having this conversation and I say that there's a such thing as white supremacy and white privilege, right, and I say that all white people are racist, that's what CRT says. Inherently, subconsciously or consciously, all of them are racist, right? So now let's take this argument another step. So what they would say to you is, if I'm in a store and I'm the store clerk, if a white person and a black person walks in the store, if the store clerk goes to the black person first, it's because he thinks he's going to steal something. If he goes to the white person first, it's because he thinks that the black person doesn't have the money to pay for it. So either way, I win the argument, right? I can always promote the idea, and I don't believe this, that all white people or all people are racist or prejudiced, right? And here's what I've heard the argument to say all white people are racist, and the white person I was around says, well, I'm not racist. And the person says, the fact that you don't even recognize it is an even bigger issue. So if I use those kind of that ideology in that argument, I can always win the argument, because either way you go, I'm going to win. So German idealism is one of the tools that they use in order to advance their argument. I don't believe you can say that about anybody. I don't believe everybody is anything, right? You can't put a blanket and say everybody is racist or not racist. You can't say everybody is good or everybody's bad, right? We're individuals, and individuals have individual ideologies, right? But I want you to understand, because you're going to probably, if you have these discussions long enough, get into a discussion with someone who adheres to these kind of concepts. It's like language now. It's like gender, right? This whole concept of gender now, because gender, it actually comes from the same thing. Gender has only a fluid meaning, and you can't say what a man is, right? This Supreme Court justice that just got nominated, Ketanji Brown, they asked her if she could define what a woman is. And what did she say? Nope, I'm not an anthropologist. I can't define what a woman is. You guys heard those hearings, right? So that concept is these concepts that we're talking about. That's the ideology behind it. Because if I can't say what a woman is, and it's only the person who's saying that what a woman is the one who helps to define it, and we don't have it kind of a understood concept. Do you guys understand that that's one of the ways you destroy the fabric of society? You take away common meanings and understandings. So if we can't define what a woman is, or I heard them say that a man can have a baby, the devil is a liar. Nobody's putting no baby. I know you guys probably thought that I was 3 months carrying, but that's part of this whole idea that words can change. They don't have to have any standard meanings. That's when you go against absolute truth and some of the other things, and truth is subjective, right? So German idealism Hegel came up with a thing that's called the Hegelian Dialectic. So with the Hegelian Dialectic, it's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or problem, reaction, solution. So in order for you to advance a certain cause, you come up with a problem, you anticipate the response, and then you provide a solution. And so these are things that are going to be important as we go forward, because their idea was that there was a certain group of people that should be in charge. That's the whole basis of Marxism. That's the basis of these other things, that there's only a certain small group of elite people that should be in charge, and they should be able to run society a certain way. And because of that, they had certain rules, not rules, but tools that they employed in order to advance their cause. That's the basis of Marxism. That's what we see here. But because we don't recognize it, and sometimes we react based on what we see, we lose the argument, right? So we're reacting to what we see now, but if you don't understand the long term, the foundation that this is laid on, or how far this stuff goes back, then you really can't win the argument, because there are real issues that occur, right? Real grievances that occur that are exaggerated, and when you exaggerate those issues, you can promote a certain idea, right? So what they did, they showed you George Floyd. Everybody in here can look at that situation with George Floyd, and as a human being, our hearts break, right? You see a man on the ground crying for his mother, even if you don't know all the backstory, but if I show you that image right there, I can get you all to agree that that's a terrible tragedy that he lost his life, right? But see, what happens is the people behind the scenes, they're anticipating the reaction and they're capitalizing on it in a way to push a certain agenda forward. So that's a real grievance that is taken out of context in order to promote a certain ideology, right? So now they're starting to push CRT, and a lot of people are like, they back up. They can't say anything because they're saying, oh, you didn't see George Floyd? You didn't see Mike Brown laying on the ground with the white cop standing over top of him? You didn't see those type of things? Right? So they're promoting the idea that America is systemically racist, and this is the proof right here. So if you're dealing with this issue right here, you're going to lose the argument, because think about if you say, yeah, but, and they go, oh, so you must not have any compassion. Like, you're not sad that man died on the ground. Do you think that's okay? Right? So a lot of times what we do, we back up and we give over to the person that's shaping the argument. So German idealism, the Frankfurt School stemmed from that. The Frankfurt School in Germany was a think tank of intellectuals that came together to see how can they spread Marxism throughout the world. And with that said, they came up with this thing called critical theory. So they first wanted to promote Marxism around the world, and it didn't work. So they recognized that one of the biggest pushbacks, or one of the biggest hindrances for to promote Marxism around the world, was the Judeo-Christian way of life. So we live in America. In Great Britain, it was Judeo-Christian way of life, and the institutions of Judeo-Christian way of thinking that was the biggest hindrance of them promoting their ideology. So what they did is they came up with this thing called critical theory, which is meant to deconstruct and tear down the pillars of the Judeo-Christian Western ideology. Are you guys with me? And there's many different facets of it. So you had the second wave feminism in the 60s. And what they did is they pushed against the matriarchy. And they said that women's lives are so terrible because of these oppressive men that just try to hinder you. And then you had people like Gloria Steinem and all these other people, and these women who just promoted this second wave feminism. But what it was is it wasn't just fighting for women's rights, because you had women's suffrage, which is a real thing. Women deserve to have the right to vote and own property and have whatever job they can qualify for. That's what women's suffrage was about. So they piggybacked off of that, and they started the feminist movement, and they expanded their scope to where men are the biggest problem. Are you guys with me? And even go against the Bible and the patriarchy. And they say, see, women, your lives are so terrible because men are always oppressing you. And then they come up with this idea that just like a woman working in the, salary inequality, that these women are doing the same work for 77 cents on the dollar, right? Now, if you really break down the math, it's not really what they promote the idea of, because think about this, people. If an employer could pay somebody 77 cents on the dollar for the same job, why wouldn't employers just hire all women? Wouldn't they do that? Wouldn't that make sense? I mean, a real business person wouldn't say, I'm not going to hire women and pay them less than the man who's doing the same job. He would probably hire all, right? Now, not to say there aren't certain issues that we have, but most of these things, they over-exaggerate it, and they'll use a isolated incident to promote their ideas of what they're talking about. So you had the feminist movement, You had the hedonism movement, the hippie movement in the 60s. That was all orchestrated by the powers that be to promote hedonism. And some of you may know what hedonism is. It's this whole idea of free love, just sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and you just live free. And it's oppressive society that tells you not to just sleep with anybody and not to get high and all that other stuff. That the reason you feel bad is because they're setting up these rules to make you feel bad. So that's part of the critical theory to deconstruct the Judeo-Western Christian ideology, right? Because we know what happened from the free love movement. You got a whole bunch of teenagers in early 20s having random sex with each other and getting high and doing all this other stuff. How many of you think that that's going to long-term bring some kind of paradise on earth? But that's what they promoted. And so think about all the brokenness that comes from it. You have all these babies that's being born. There's no structure. There's no discipline. All these drug addicts and stuff. And so naturally what happened? It made way, the free love of the 60s made way for Roe versus Wade. Because guess what? You have all these babies. You get pregnant. You don't need to be carrying all these babies. You could just get rid of it. So all these things were orchestrated to deconstruct the Judeo-Western culture. And there's the whole thing of male and female relationships. You have LGBTQIA 2+ now. You know that's a real thing. 2+ is two spirits. And again, and I just want to say before I go any further that I'm not knocking a person who may feel like they're in that lifestyle. What I'm talking about is the agenda to promote it as normal and to victimize and villainize those who stand for the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview, which is one man, one woman. Black Lives Matter itself was not about helping black people. If you guys saw it when it first started, it was about black transgenders. And they wanted to deconstruct the family structure. And they said that the biggest harm was, what did they call it? They called it heteronormative thinking that they were trying to attack. You guys know what, has anybody heard of heteronormative thinking before that? Heteronormative thinking was supposed to be a bad word to say this whole idea that we think that marriage should only be between one man and one woman is bad. So that's part of the critical theory of deconstructing this idea. Now they have it to where even a lot of people are accepting, oh, I don't want to be homophobic. I don't want to be judgmental. I don't want, right? Because that's part of the long process of deconstructing first in your mind and then society. So first they convinced us that it was okay, it was normal, and then they helped to get laws passed to protect it. And now there's laws that's passed in order to criminalize and villainize those who oppose that. Even if you speak out against it, they call it hate speech now. Right? That's intentional, right? Those all are different components of this critical theory part, which critical race theory is one of the proponents, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is what I talked about earlier, Mark Engel and Hegel. I got, when Black Lives Matter first became popular, right after the George Floyd thing, I did a video on YouTube and say why I don't stand with Black Lives Matter, and I took a lot of flack for it, because people didn't understand it. And a friend of mine sent me some screenshots of the Black Lives Matter organization have a discussion about me. Do you guys know who this pastor in Harrisburg is? What is he talking about? And she sent me the whole thing and they're talking about me. She's like, they're talking about you. So I celebrated, Nate, because I was like, I made it. They're talking about me, you know what I mean? I got internet beef. You know, y'all young people, you know that's when you made it, when you got internet beef. You know that's when you made it big, right? But anyway, they were going down the line and they were saying, oh, he probably learned about Marxism from his white evangelical friends that taught him about Marxism. So my second video was, my follow-up video was I was holding up Karl Marx's publication, The Communist Manifesto, and I said, this is where I learned about Marxism from Karl Marx. So when they start talking about deconstructing the nuclear family and all those things, it was because they recognized that those were the biggest hindrances to keep Marxism from taking root. And they have promoted it, and one of the things that they did was they actually infiltrated the school systems. They've infiltrated the teachers' college, where a lot of these teachers, administrators, and those who run teachers' colleges have Marxist ideology, and so they're promoting Marxist ideology with our school teachers, and it's becoming, and our college professors is becoming so prevalent, so now they're indoctrinating our children to believe these things. So you have to be very careful and understand. Now, for the record, if any of you are teachers or administrators in here, I'm not talking about you. I don't know. But I'm saying this is the strategy that they've done. And these are real things that they have infiltrated these things because they recognize if they can start indoctrinating and teaching children these things at a younger and younger age, then there'll be, the whole public will sway. And realize, too, that a lot of the strategies that they're employed, they perfected it in Nazi Germany with the Ministry of Propaganda. They came up with the idea of how do you get the sway public opinion. And what they called it, because Karl Marx, and those people that really were proponents of Marxism and communism, the first wave was violent revolutions, right? So the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Chinese Revolution, where there were 30 to 50 million people killed when the communists came and took over, and even throughout Europe. So they had this whole idea of violent revolution, but then they start to realize that it's hard to have a violent revolution because there's so much bloodshed and life loss. So they came up with this concept of a revolution without bloodshed. And there's a thing called cultural hegemony that goes along with this. And what cultural hegemony is, of course, along with critical theory, is if we attack the pillars of Judeo-Christian, the Judeo-Christian worldview and teach a new type of culture, then it will weaken the individual, and the individual will become easier to control by the state. Just like hedonism. Do you know? Can you guys think about what happens if you teach people that hedonism basically is pleasure is the ultimate goal? So you're not living with purpose and trying to raise your family and doing all these type of things, but your ultimate goal is pleasure. And a lot of our young people buy into this now. This whole concept of adolescence, and I know I'm going to step on some toes now, but adolescence was part of what they did, what they came up with, because they taught young people, hey, you don't need to get so serious so soon. You're too young to get married. Go out and enjoy yourself and sow your wild oats and all this other stuff. That was a way to promote this idea of hedonism and living simply for pleasure, as opposed to, because how many of you have been married for a long time and you realize that marriage and raising families and to live your life with purpose is really the thing that gives you the most joy and peace, right? Not going out here randomly, just doing whatever you want to do. And we've done a disservice, I say a lot of times in the churches when we promote the idea to go out, oh, you guys are too young to get married. And the only thing that happens is when you tell young people they're too young to get married and go out and enjoy yourself, you're just having them accumulate baggage, that's all. So they go out here and accumulate all this baggage because of, they're living their life and being selfish and self-centered. And now it comes time to get married, and they're like, man, you mean I got to just be with one person the rest of my life? I can't just come and go as I please, right? But they understood that psychologically in Germany, not only German idealism, but psychologists like Freud and different things like that studied the human brain. B.F. Skinner, with operant conditioning, they studied the human psyche not as a way to just understand the human mind, but how can you control and manipulate groupthink in the masses. And so all these things are part of that. Cultural hegemony. Antonio Gramsci, he came up with this idea that, as I said earlier, hegemony is that there's a ruling class of people that should be in charge, and that if they run things, then they'll have paradise on earth. But instead of having violent revolutions, they came up with a way to promote ideas that cause the people to destroy themselves, and therefore they're easier to manipulate and control. And it's thought out long term, which is why I said when we have these conversations, you have to understand the philosophies that underlie them and not just look at what's happening now, because if you just look at what's happening now, you're going to lose the argument. If you're just reacting to what you see now but not understand all these pillars that are set up under this, then you really can't fully understand it, and it's easy for you to be duped by the enemy. And just to let you know, let me tell you how far this philosophy goes back. Some of you probably are familiar with this concept of doing whatever you want to do and not following the rules that God gave us. Genesis 3, you guys familiar with that story? Right? The enemy came up with that a long time ago. He told Adam and Eve, you don't have to do what God told you to do. You can do whatever you want to do. You can be your own God. It's your thing. Do whatever you want to do. Remember that song back in the days? Some of you are too young for that one. Right? This whole concept of do your own thing and be what you want to be. Right? And they're teaching our kids. You know, Disney teaches that a lot to our kids now. Don't let anybody tell you who to be. You can be whatever you want to be. They're basically telling them not to listen to their parents. There was a Dr. Spock, not the one from Star Trek. There was a Dr. Spock back in the 40s and 50s start to write the concept that you shouldn't punish your children. You shouldn't deprive your children from things. And so one of the things they said was, which was ridiculous, you shouldn't make your kids eat their vegetables first and then give them dessert. If they want to eat the dessert first, let them eat the dessert. Right? That's how ridiculous it was. In California, and I hope nobody here from California. No, I'm just kidding about that part. But they came up with schools that didn't have grades. Or they came up with participation trophies. You know what a participation trophy is, right? If 10 people race, you don't give first, second, and third. You give everybody a trophy for participating. Because they said if you give somebody first or second or third, then it will hurt their ego and damage them as an individual. But what it did is it made weakened children, which became weakened human beings. Because guess what? When you go out in the world sometimes, can you imagine if I don't take constructive criticism, or if I think I can do whatever I want to, nobody's going to say anything, and then I go to a job and I have a poor work performance, and then the boss goes, you stink, man, what are you doing? You didn't do nothing right. And I go, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're criticizing me, right? They did a study in colleges. One of the teachers was trying to teach on this whole idea of socialism, Marxism, or going away from first, second, and third, or giving all A's to a A student and a B to a B student, which is part of what Marxism is trying to do. And I'm going to move a little bit quickly because I want to, leave a couple of minutes for Q&A. So this college professor did this experiment. And he says instead of giving A's to somebody who does the best and B's and C's and D's, I'm going to give everybody the same grade, right? Because it's not fair for me to give you an A and give somebody else a D. So the first project, you have A students, you have naturally people that will do 100% work, and they care about it, they consider about the work, they put forth the effort and all those type of things. So the first assignment, you had that A student, the person, the teacher's pet that always does above and beyond, does extra credit. They did what they normally do. And then you had the C students and the D students that only do just enough to get by, right? But by the end of the experiment, it didn't make the C and D students do A work. It made the A students not care anymore, and they did subpar work. So that philosophy is trying to be promoted in America from the idea that, going against, what do they call it, American exceptionalism? Because what happens is socialism says we're just going to spread the wealth. And if you worked hard and you were able to accumulate wealth and do all those type of things, then it's not right that you are a millionaire and some people don't have millions, so we're going to share the wealth. But the only thing that does is that demotivates the person that will really do all the work, right? So all these ideas, just like in critical race theory, they'll say it's wrong that certain people have money and wealth and other people don't, and so what should you do? You should take from the rich and give to the poor. You should take from white America and give to black people. The social services and welfare system is based on that too. You guys know that? It's based on cultural, they call it social Darwinism. They created the welfare system as a way to, not to help black Americans or people in poverty, but to keep them dependent on the government. So you have critical race theory here. It's supposed to be an educational research thing that gives data, but it's more than that. They're editorializing history. They're telling black people that the reason you can't succeed in America is because of white supremacy. They're telling white people that the reason you have more than others is because you have white privilege. And it's ignoring the actual effort that's put forth. It's ignoring the very basic things, principles that actually give you success or not success. Martin Luther King talked about the content of the character versus the color of their skin, right? He didn't want black people to be promoted because they're black or deprived of opportunities because they're black. He wanted people to be judged on the content of their character, right? Critical race theory tells you that black people can't succeed because of white supremacy in America, and that because the country is systemically racist, that it hinders black people from getting ahead. And I don't buy into that. I believe that there are challenges that we have faced, and there are times and situations where black people have been hindered historically, but I don't believe that this is now, that this is that time. I did a talk in Pittsburgh, and I talk about historically the challenges that black people did face, but I also talked about the laws that were passed in order to even the playing field. And I want you guys to know something too. We don't want equity, we want equality. Equity versus equality. We don't want equality of outcomes, we want equality of opportunities. That's what America is about, equality of opportunities, not equality of outcomes. That's what socialism does. Socialism promotes equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunities, right? This is the land of opportunity. And so what they had to do was pass laws that allowed black people to get opportunities. And once they gave them opportunities, they're able to succeed. But critical race theory tells them that you won't have equal opportunities because you started off at a staggered place. I heard Bernie Sanders say, it's a shame that these rich people's kids graduate from college with no college debt, and poor people graduate from college and they have all this college debt. Do you guys know why rich people's kids come out of college without debt? Because their parents are rich and they pay for them to go to college. Right? Doesn't that make sense? The inheritance tax, a high inheritance tax, is a Marxist ideology, because what they're doing is they're punishing a wealthy person who wants to pass wealth on to their children, right? So all these things are promoted as an idea of equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunities. Political correctness. Political correctness is something that you guys have probably heard a lot lately, and that's part of propaganda, which shapes your language in a way that you can't say certain things, right? Anybody ever read 1984? Would they have the thing called newspeak, right? So they start to shape language, because if you can change language, you can change people's mindset. If you can't speak against something and only one ideology is being promoted, then it makes the public as a whole think that that's true, right? So if, for instance, there's certain things you can't say nowadays, or they'll say that's offensive. On YouTube, they're censoring people. Censorship is one of the greatest weapons of Marxism, because once they start censoring your speech and telling you what you can say, then ultimately that affects how you think. And if you don't hear any opposing viewpoints, then ultimately you're going to believe the viewpoint that you hear the most of. And so the media and all these other people that are really promoting this Marxist ideology is trying to shape the public's thinking in a way that causes people not to hear opposing viewpoints. You know, certain college campuses now, they call them safe spaces, safe zones. Have you guys heard of that? So they say that you shouldn't have to go to college and hear an opposing viewpoint. Have you heard that? That's why they censored a lot of these conservative speakers. They couldn't go on college campuses because they said, no, this is a safe space and they shouldn't have to hear things that may offend them. I don't know about you, but life is offensive at times. And if I never hear anything that offends me, what happens when I do hear something that offends me? You know, there's certain speech. I got into a debate with someone else, and I thank God for Elon Musk. I think that what he has said, whether he's sincere or not, hopefully he's sincere, but he talked about how dangerous it was that some of these platforms are censoring people that have ideologies that they deem as offensive. You guys realize that the First Amendment was so important. It's an anti-Marxist law, because they recognize in order for the Marxists to take over, one of the first things they do is change your speech, right? So freedom of speech is important for us. and those other things, because if you can shape speech, you can change how people think, and you can control the minds and thinking of people. Political correctness stems from the Frankfurt School, because they recognize if they can tell you that you can't say certain things. So if you get publicly, if you say that you don't believe that a man and a man should be married, that's considered hate speech or homophobic. That's a way of shaping how you talk about things. If you say that, what's some of the other things they say? If right now, if I identified as a woman and I told you to use her, she as my pronoun, if you call me a he, that's considered hate speech. In certain places, they actually passed laws that said if you get convicted of hate speech, then you can be criminalized. That can be criminalized. Are you guys following this? It's really dangerous. And so when we see these type of things, critical race theory, and what they're saying now is if you're against critical race theory, then you're either racist or you just don't want history to be taught. But that's not what this is about, right? It's editorializing history. Conflict theory, that goes back to Marx and different things like that. Again, you can get this slideshow and read through it. Conflict theory says there's always conflicts between two groups of people, and ultimately they're the ones that cause the conflict. We talked about Hegel, that you have problem, reaction, and solution. So what they do is they stir up conflict between two groups of people. Someone is always the oppressor and someone is always the victim. Right? In critical theory, when I talked about male versus female, they say that women are always oppressed and men are always the oppressor. Black and white, right? Black people are always the victim and white people are always the oppressor. That's what they promote, that idea, right? If you're gay, they say the reason that you feel like you want to, you don't feel good about yourself is because of this heteronormative thinking that wants to oppress you and keep you from being who you want to be. Oppressor versus victim. Critical race theory, type of legal scholarship that emerged in the 1980s. The ideology emerged long before that, but it became more prominent in the 1980s. Reaction to perceived failure of traditional civil rights litigations to produce meaningful reform. Racism is a normal part of American society and has been so throughout our history. That's the basis for critical race theory. America is a racist country. It's based on white supremacy, and black people can't succeed because of white supremacy and white privilege. That's what they try to promote the ideas. And there's people now that are to the place where they start to believe that. And I'll say to you that a lot of those people must not have went to other countries. Because let me tell you something, humans in their fallen state will always find reasons to divide from each other and to hurt each other. If you go into Rwanda, they had a civil war between the Hutus and the Tutsis. They were all Rwandans, but they were different tribes. And they found a way to separate each other and differentiate between those two tribes in a way that they murdered hundreds of thousands of people. If you went to China, China is one of the most monolithic cultural, racial countries in the world. But when the communists took over, 30 to 50 million Chinese people were killed. They were killed by the Chinese. Throughout the world, if you look at the majority of people that were killed or abused or mistreated, 90% of them are mistreated by people of the same, what we call race or same color. So don't believe the fact that the white-black thing is the worst thing in the world, right? Because around the world, this happens all the time, that people are being oppressed, people are being victimized, people are being killed. And it's because of the fallen nature of humanity. It's not because racism is the number one issue that we face. Do you know that black people in America are the number one victims and perpetrators of homicide in America? If you look in Chicago a couple years, or even Philadelphia now, 500 to 600 people get killed every year. The majority of people get killed not by white cops, but get killed by people of their own color. And what I would say to you is that's the fallen nature of humanity, that they create an atmosphere. Marxism creates an atmosphere, especially in the urban areas or concentration of people, where God is removed from the whole process, and you have broken families, you have broken individuals, you have all these things that occur, and that causes a rise in violence and different things like that, right? All these urban areas, these major cities where you hear all these problems at, where you hear police brutality and all the things that happen poorly to people, most of them are democratic cities. I'm sorry. I meant liberal. They're liberals. And what I say liberal has become, and has evolved to that now. because Marxists have now taken on the more liberal approach, right? That's how they did in the first place, because they go against the Judeo-Christian ideology, right, of marriage, family, morals, sexual purity. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but the world has become so over-sexualized now. Have you guys noticed that? See, you guys don't even want to answer, because some of the guys are sitting beside your woman and you don't want to say, yeah, because your wife will be like, well, what do you mean by that? Oh, you've been watching something on TV that I should know about? No, I'm just kidding. But society is becoming over-sexualized. Look at some of the performers. Look at some of these performers like on the Grammys and stuff. They're half naked, they're gyrating around. That's intentional. I know you guys don't watch that kind of stuff, so if you look at all the movies, all the TV shows now, they always will have a gay character. They always have a transgender character. Everything is about, all those things. Those are all parts of critical theory to deconstruct the Judeo-Christian Western way of thinking. And it's intentional. So this is too small for you. Probably have to get this, but this goes in a little bit. It talks historically. A gentleman by the name of Derek Bell back in 1992 is considered the father of critical race theory. This just has some resources that you can look up for yourself. So again, we'll provide the slides and you can see it just so you'll be familiar with them. You can have these conversations. But here's some data that goes against critical race theory. So, when you saw the George Floyd thing and the Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, what did they promote? They promoted the idea that white cops are going around gunning down unarmed black males, right? That's the idea. And because they show it to you over and over again, it comes across as fact. But what I would say to you is in 2019, the Department of Justice stated that about 19 unarmed black males got killed by police officers, 38 white unarmed people got killed by police officers. How many times have you seen a white unarmed person that got killed by a police officer on CNN? I've never seen that, right? Because they don't show it. But if twice as many unarmed white people got killed by police officers in black, then we would have to come to the conclusion that maybe it's not based on race, but it's based on maybe these police officers need to be trained better. Maybe there should be different ways that they approach people, right? But of course, they're promoting the idea, and it looks real because only thing you saw. Think about the optics of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. He got shot by white police officers and killed. He didn't have a gun or anything on him. And all week they showed Mike Brown laying on the pavement and the white police officers walking back and forth past him. Those optics are really bad, right? That goes into your sensibilities, and you start to say, man, that's horrible. Look how they treated that person. George Floyd, how many times did you see? Maybe you didn't see that video. How many times did they show that video? 1,000,000 times. They kept showing it to you over and over and over again. That's to change your way of thinking, and you start to begin to think it's horrible how they treat black people. Maybe that was a terrible cop. Maybe there was other extenuating circumstances. Again, I'm not saying it was okay what happened to George Floyd. It was tragic. It broke my heart. I couldn't really watch it that much but I want us to look at it that it wasn't, I should be heartbroken not just because it was a white cop and a black man, but because that was a human being that got killed, right? That was a human being that lost their lives. That's why I should be heartbroken. I shouldn't automatically go to white versus black. And so I'm going to give you these stats, and then I'm going to bring this to a close. In America right now from 2018, so they talk about white supremacy, white privilege. They talk about how this is set up against minorities. Oh, I shouldn't show you this. I was going to ask you a question, so I don't want to give you the answer before I ask the question. Does anybody know, and you probably read it already now, is there anyone who knows what is the highest people group in America from an educational standpoint and household income standpoint? Does anybody know the number one people group right now in America? It's West Africans, West African immigrants. They have the highest educational performance and the highest household income. Just so you know, West Africa, the people that come here are black. They're black-skinned, right? They're number one in America. Guess who number two is? Asians. So if white supremacy is the prevailing theme in the country, how are these black people from Africa outproducing everybody else? You know why? Because they have a strong culture, they have strong family unit, and they have a focus on education. They don't make any excuses, right? Do you guys know that Asians outperform whites to such a degree that Harvard just got sued because if they didn't, 40 to 50% of Harvard students would be Asians because they outperform as far as the SATs, math and science and all that other stuff. So white supremacy is the prevailing theme. How do these Asian immigrants outperform other people, right? So these are statistics that go against the whole idea of white supremacy. But there's things that we can do, individuals. You have strong family unit, you have a strong culture, and you have strong morals, and your focus is on education, and that's how you succeed. And the Marxists knew that. That's why they attacked the family unit, they attack the morals of people, and they get us to focus on hedonism and materialism instead of the principles that make you strong as a culture and a community. And that's what the church is supposed to do, right? The church is supposed to promote family ideas. The church is supposed to promote non-hedonism, right? Don't go out and I know, I'm sure your pastor, I can't speak for him, but I'm sure he doesn't tell you to go out and sow your wild oats, right? And have fun, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. If he does, then maybe that's a different conversation, Nate, but I'm sure, right? Because those are principles that make us strong and not based on race or skin color or anything like that. So here you go. This was the Houston Chronicle says, Nigerian immigrants have the highest levels of education in this city and the nation, surpassing whites and Asians, according to the census data bolstered by analysts of 13 Houston area surveys. This is the Pew Research. Sub-Saharan immigrants in the United States are also more highly educated than U.S. native-born population. Goes against the whole idea that white supremacy is number one, right? So I know I gave you guys a lot of information. Hopefully we'll be unpacking it even more as the other things. I wanted to get through things just to give you a foundation. And please forgive me if I threw up too much information on you, but I think you guys can handle it, right? I didn't give you too much, right? You guys got most of it?